us. We haven't talked, as often as we did during the election cycle, but things seem to be happening every single day. And most of that news has been pretty grim. So maybe, Simon, you could kick it off with a brief summary of the how the world is reacting to this. What does polling tell you about how the world is reacting to Trump sending troops into our cities, suppressing free speech, and getting ready maybe to have a big parade for himself if the weather permits?
10 days ago, Trump had a series of pretty good polls. Like his numbers had come up from sort of the bottom that they had been at a couple months earlier due to his tariffs and his terrible government. But then I think a couple big things happened. I think the attack, Elon Musk's attack on Trump, I think was significant. I think it was because it was heard in the MAGA world. I mean, none of us can really break into MAGA world. Elon did. And Elon emasculated Trump. He humiliated Trump. He called for his removal from office. And I think this has had an impact on his standing with some of his supporters and weak supporters. But then the second thing that happened is that he overreacted, and I think he and Stephen Miller, because Stephen Miller's wife has now left the White House and is working for Elon. So whatever that all means, it looks like two men were emasculated last week, and the two little boys got really angry and they called in the Marines and the National Guard to sort of make themselves strong again after having been humiliated. And it was an overreaction.
So wait a second. You're blaming Elon Musk for taking Stephen Miller's wife for why there are Marines in LA? I'm just trying to understand.
I'm not saying.
I haven't heard that connection exactly that way. I'm here for it.
I'm not saying these are causally connected. I'm saying these things happen, in order, in sequence, right? And we will find out someday when the books are written. But all of a sudden, like the two boys had their egos bruised and their butts hurt. And, the way they had to deal with it is by getting really strong and macho. And they called in the Marines and the National Guard, over 300 protesters in an LA suburb, and tried to be super macho guys. And what's happened is the country has, we now have enough data in the last couple of days that's polling after the weekend. Trump has taken a big hit in his approval rating. He's now more than 10 points underwater on immigration in these polls. He's more than 10 points underwater on deportations. And all of a sudden, it looks like this guy the economy was failing. He was getting beat in the courts, right, all the time, that Doge didn't produce what he wanted. He's been, Putin is treating him like a rag doll and ignoring him and pretending he doesn't matter. Bibi's now defying him. He's being defied by and failing all over the place. And as I say, he's weak. He's not strong. And then they did this kind of impulsive, wild thing, and it's backfiring on them based on the data so far. And so in this world that we have to live in of traditional politics, conventional politics, political gravity, he's having a really bad week. Again, after having had a really bad week last week. And, it gives me a little bit of hope that, that people are coming to realize that this guy isn't what many people hoped he would be, and that there's a sense of betrayal. And then finally, they are way out of whack with the public on where they are on the treatment of immigrants. I mean, the way that I say this simply, the American people are very tough on the border, right? They want border security, keep people out. But for the people who are here, 20 years of polling has shown us that they want humane treatment of the people that are here. This is inhumane treatment, and it is over the top. This was never going to be popular. And there's been I would consider, as somebody who's been reading polling on immigration for 20 years, the reaction has been significantly negative, more negative than I would have anticipated based on the data that's come in the last couple of days. So the way I like to say this, David, is that Trump is weak. He's not strong. He's a loser. He's not a winner. He's a big bubbly baby man. He's not a strong man. And we have to keep that in our mind all the time as we keep the darkness and the ugliness and the urgency we have about all the things that he's breaking in our mind simultaneously.
So, Tara, you feeling better? Should we have these therapy sessions more often? Or
I
do you?
do. I do
Yeah,
love moments of delight right now, just in general, and I would say I think we all were gifted many moments of delight during the Musk Trump public, breakup. I also love that we can put to bed forever. I believe that women are too emotional to be leaders. I think that is fair to say now that men are quite emotional as leaders. And also, the only thing that I want to challenge a little bit, Simon, that you said, or not challenge, but just sort of unpack, is that you mentioned that the what's happening in California, I think, is what you were referring to as impulsive, and I actually think this has been the plan all along, and that it was just a matter of time. And this was a really good time because they had to both distract from. I love your theory. I am on board and on the train of your theory that they needed to actually look strong after looking so pathetic and weak in their public fight, but also they needed to distract from what they know is deeply unpopular about their horrific betrayal of a tax bill. Because it was starting to actually get a lot more attention, the Medicaid cuts and the people showing up at the town halls and the personal stories. And so this was really well timed to give the Republican senators, whether they lobbied for it or not, a gift to be able to turn the attention back to the immigration side of that bill, as opposed to the healthcare side that they know they can't win on. And that is the job of all of us and everybody on the pro-democracy side, is to not to ignore at all what is happening in California, around the country, related to this horrific and inhumane deportations, but to not also lose sight of making sure that we are drilling down and communicating every day about what the cuts to Medicaid and SNAP benefits and the job losses inherent in those would do to society writ large and to communities as well. So they are basically ripping apart the threads and fabric of our communities on all fronts right now, and that's the challenge, is how it is all happening at once. But I do believe that this was quite the design.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think one of the subtexts of all of this that I'm interested in is the competing, memes, what imagery they're putting out versus what imagery we're putting out or we're not putting out. And of course, when they had a few rioters or a few protesters with a Mexican flag, they were like, okay, see what this is? This is, these are attacks on the U.S. But Jacob Soboroff on MSNBC yesterday showed a helicopter pursuing farm workers through a field that looked like a frickin' scene from Inglorious Bastards, where the Nazis are going after the Jews who are running through the field. It was hideous. And, to me, it's like, you got to be apropos of your point, Simon. This is the kind of thing you got to take and re-show over and over and over again. And it seems to me like Trump and company actually are giving us a lot to work with. Last night he went to the Kennedy Center because he loves Les Mis, apparently, although he doesn't know which character.
He doesn't know what it is. He doesn't know what it is.
He doesn't know anything about it. But he was there. But people booed him, and they, it's this parade. The imagery of this parade on Saturday strikes me as potentially awful. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you just put a lot on the table. So let me go through it quickly. Is that I think, to Tara's point, what's happened is they started escalating on the immigration front several weeks ago, right? And they got this court ruling from the Supreme Court where they could invalidate almost 1 million what are called TPS holders, people temporary protected status, meaning that there are now 1 million people in South Florida who within the next few months are going to become stateless. These are all people that have jobs. They were here legally. They came legally. They had work permits. Their kids are in school. And all of a sudden, because of Trump's extremism, 1 million people in South Florida can't go home to Venezuela, to Cuba, to Nicaragua, right? And they're going to be stateless. And so you have this humanitarian crisis that's growing. That's not my dog, by the way, David. And
okay, it's my dog.
I don't have one, so
and the stateless people in South Florida, and And then they did the travel ban last week, right? So they have been escalating to the point that Tara was making, that hopefully we can edit all that out, that Tara was making, that there was already this escalation going on because I think that they understood that their broader agenda was failing and that they were running into turbulence. So there was this process of escalation. Last week, Stephen Miller had all the regional heads of ICE in to say, we need 3,000 arrests a day. It's not going enough, because I think she's right about the analysis, right? That they were ratcheting all this up. But what happened over the weekend, I think, was this sort of, they accelerated the process of the provocation in the way that Tara was correct and right about. But it was done in part because the other thing they were learning was that ICE and DHS are not equipped to remove 10 to 15 million people out of the country. And so all of a sudden, among the failures that were, of all these failures that we went through, was the process of the deportations themselves. And they needed to ratchet it up. And so what they did is, by calling in the military, they were achieving two things. One is they actually need help in the deportation of 10 to 15 million people, because a lot of these ICE folks aren't trained to go into residential neighborhoods and pull people out of houses or Home Depots, and they were failing at it. And so the scope and scale of the deportation effort was insufficient, and they needed more. But they also need the terror aspect, the helicopters, the Marines, right? Because there are other strategies. They want people to self-deport. And the faster that people self-deport, leave voluntarily, the less they have to go to these extreme measures. And so they brought in the scariest thing you possibly could bring in, which is the Marines, right? Actual active duty, war fighters. And so this has been a dramatic escalation in the last few days, and the American people are recoiling at this, David. And so, yes, I do think they have overreached, they've overshot. I do think this was impulsive in the way, Tara, I'll defend my impulsive argument, is that because I think that the hitting the military button was not something that was always going to be a last resort thing, because they understood there was going to be resistance to this. But they did it. And now here we are where we are. And I think the great news is that the American people are just like, what the fuck, and they don't like this. And they don't like helicopters hunting down people in the fields. The other thing that's happened, by the way, is that the Hispanic community, which had migrated over to the Republicans in the last election, have fled Trump. He's in the latest Economist YouGov poll, he's minus 27 on job approval of Hispanic voters. Week one, it was minus 5. He's lost over 22 points with Hispanic voters. It doesn't mean they've come to the Democrats. I want to be clear about that. But this stuff is breaking through in the Hispanic community and is attenuating or severing the relationship he had with Hispanics. Finally, to me, one of the most significant things that happened in the last 10 days in all this is that in Miami, I was just down in Florida, in South Florida, the Cubans are starting to break from Trump. His most ardent supporters in South Florida are breaking. The woman who founded the national organization called Latinas for Trump, a state senator in Miami named State Senator Garcia, wrote a long screed against Trump and the administration, saying that these policies were inhumane and unacceptable. And so you're seeing this incredible backlash happen even in his core areas of support. And just today, the president attacked the ag community and hotel and travel and tourist people for complaining about the removal, as he said in his own post, of longstanding employees that will be impossible to replace. And what he was telling the ag businesses and hotels and restaurants is, F you guys, I'm pulling all your people out. He claims they're here illegally and all this other stuff, all this crazy language. And so now you have this growing defiance to this insane policy that's happening all across the country. And yes, they thought they were doing this, to Tara's point, to change the subject, to make things better, and it's made things worse. And thank God, by the way, that this has been the reaction of the American people in the last few days.
Do you want to respond to any of that, Tara? Because there was a lot there.
Yeah, no. I don't disagree with that. I think, we always knew, and Simon said as much too, that they were always going to hit the military button. That is part of the overall strategy, right? They need to do that. They need to instill fear. They need to create some sense of military states in blue states, especially like the one that has the biggest economy in the country. And so we all knew that was a matter of time. I think that Simon's probably right that it was faster than they thought, and that I think they expected the backlash too. I remember that first interview Trump did after his inauguration. I think it was with Meet the Press sit down, where he said, "You media, when we start doing these deportations that the voters voted me in for and that they wanted, you're gonna, focus on the families torn apart and not the actual, this is what the American people want." Like, he knew that that part was going to have a backlash. But Simon, to your earlier point about how inhumane this is, like, they are treating this quota thing of 3,000 a day. And Stephen Miller is, in my opinion, like the most evil human, if not the, then one of. It is literally these people pulling people out who have nothing. And it is the betrayal to his voters that did want criminals out of this country who were undocumented. That was what they thought they were voting for. That's what Trump talked about all the time. And they have absolutely no proof that the vast majority of these folks that they are ripping away from their families who've been here for decades, some of them, if not longer, have absolutely no criminal records whatsoever. And I think that reckoning is really important. I don't know. I don't see, I guess, where I lack the hopium, Simon, and maybe you can give me some more of it, is that, if they still get this bill passed and they have meaningfully distracted the entire news cycle and all of the Americans focused on immigration and this, for better and for worse, because it is hitting his polling and it will continue to, but they still get this bill passed and it is disastrous to every other piece of this country and fabric of this country, then, what have we won in this, right? We have to translate this into action for the midterms, yes, but I am actually very scared about them passing the bill and quieting protests with more military presence.
Listen, I think this is a legitimate and serious concern, because I think that one of the reasons they did this last week was that, on Thursday and Friday, the press coverage and the insidery publications in D.C. was the Senate bill was starting to run into serious turbulence. And I think Trump is probably communicating now that we're in this national emergency of 300 people protesting in an L.A. suburb, that, they all need to get in line and get this thing done, right? I think this was part of the tactic and the decision making. The problem is that for them is that I think the Senate, many, many senators, more than they want, have come to believe that this bill is a bad bill, right? And for different reasons. People have different reasons, right? The deficit is too high. The Medicaid cuts are too deep. The rolling back the clean energy tax credits are too extreme and going to hurt industry in their states, right? There's a variety of reasons that people have stated for their concerns. But I will tell you that in the Economist YouGov poll today that came out today, the bill is 30% approve, 50% disapprove. The disapproval rating on this bill is higher than any other part of his agenda right now, right? So he's got really low marks on the economy, really low marks on inflation, really low marks now on deportations and immigration. And so they're pivoting now to a bill that is the single most unpopular thing that he's actually proposed or done. And so politically, this thing is an incredible turkey and a heavy lift, right? Because it's just dying of its own weight with the public, because it is going to do so much harm to the country. So at least I would say, Tara, my optimism here is that, I've been in Washington a long time. I've worked on the legislation. I don't think the Senate Republicans want to pass this thing. And it doesn't mean that they won't end up coming around at the end of the day. But the opposition is much more significant. This thing slowed down incredibly in the last 10 days. And, I think your point is correct. Job number one, and I say this at Hopium every day, job number one is to kill this bill. I mean, this is the number one thing we all have to be working on with all the might that we have, because it's going to risk the fiscal integrity of the United States. It's going to cut food. It's going to make healthcare more expensive for tens of millions of people. Tens of millions are going to lose their insurance. All the stuff that we all know. It's reckless. It's dangerous. It's helping move the tax burden from wealthy people to middle class people. And everything about it is the way I describe it is that it's more for me, Trump, and less for everybody else. And so you're right. We need to keep the focus as hard as we possibly can on killing this bill. We can do more than one thing at a time.